let's kind of dive into this discussion about hypertension. I think it's so important to talk about hypertension, but really to kind of help you understand kind of the origins of hypertension and what does it really mean when your doctor says that your blood pressure is high and what we can do about it. So here I have a little drawing that I put together. So when you're thinking about what your blood pressure really is, I want you to think about the heart output, what the heart is putting out. So the volume of fluid that's pumping through your heart, but also the strength involved in pushing that blood out. And it's the output, the heart output, along with the diameter of your blood vessels, right? So if you think about it, you're out here, so it's becoming springtime. Some of us are going to be in the yard watering the yard. My daughters and I, we washed the car this weekend. So if you don't have one of those little pressure valves on the end of your hose, what do? You put your thumb in front of it, right? And the thumb decreases the diameter of the hose and it increases the pressure. So you can spray your car or spray the flowers with full force because of that. So the same thing is happening in the body. Our blood vessels are going back and forth between being larger and skinnier, fatter and skinnier. And when they are fat and wide open, we call that vasodilation. And when they are tiny and tight, we call that vasoconstriction. So our body is going through this nice song and dance of trying to balance between being vasodilated and large or being constricted and tight. And as you can imagine, when the blood vessels are constricted and tight, that's when the pressure is going to be higher. As you can imagine, when the heart is pushing out more volume, the pressure is going to be higher. You can imagine when the heart is pounding it out and pushing that fluid out and spewing it out, that pump, that strength is making the blood pressure a little higher. So when we think about vasodilation or the blood vessels being fat so that blood can flow nicely through it versus blood vessels being tight so that the blood flow is shooting through it, you're thinking about it in terms of vascular resistance, right? If you were like me, maybe you hated physics, but resistance is kind of what we're talking about here. And what we're talking about is how wide are the blood vessels, how stiff are the blood vessels, and are those blood vessels functioning properly? Meaning, are they properly doing their job of going back and forth between being large and being tiny? And is the lining of that blood vessel doing what it needs to do to kind of go through this process, right? Because you're going to need less blood flow at certain points when you're not stressed out and everything's easy. So those blood vessels are wide open. Now, all of a sudden, something is happening. You've got to be on high alert. You're stressed. And now the blood vessels are getting tiny because they're shooting the blood flow very fast to where we need it, right? So how wide, how stiff, and how functional are these blood vessels? And that is going to be kind of what impacts blood pressure, right? So blood pressure, what I did here is I kind of took, you see the positive blue, right? When you see that blue in a plus, that means it's got positive impact on things. So vitamin D levels, having those balanced, that's got a positive impact on blood pressure. Magnesium levels has a positive impact on blood pressure. Nitric oxide levels, positive impact. Antioxidants, positive impact. Now, what are antioxidants? Those are things that we take in through our nutrients, through our smoothies, however you're doing it, that are counteracting free radical species, or those things in our bodies that are like, destructive, like in Space Invaders, where you're like, bloop, 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 bloop. Those are free radicals. Those are radical oxygen species, and antioxidants fight those away, right? But what might have a negative impact on our blood pressure are having too high levels of calcium. Right? Because we're talking about stiffness. You don't need too much calcium because now your blood vessels are going to get stiff, right? We talked about that. If the stiffer they are, the higher the blood pressure is going to be. Insulin resistance is going to impact this process of, are the blood vessels working properly? High blood sugar is going to impact whether or not those blood vessels are going to expand and contract in the way that we want them to. Aging impacts our blood vessels. The lining of our blood vessels. Reactive oxygen species, those are the that's impacting negatively. Stress is impacting negatively on our blood pressure, and toxins are doing the same. So let's talk about how this process of hypertension even comes to be, right? You go to the doctor and they're like, well, your blood pressure is a little high. We'll just kind of keep an eye on it. And then 2 or 3 visits later, they're like, yep, you have hypertension. You need to go on medication, right? So what does that look like? So the first step to developing hypertension, or even the first step in atherosclerosis, which is heading towards heart disease, but we can just call it disease of the body, because once the blood vessels actually start to become diseased, everything eventually starts to become diseased. The first step is something called endothelial cell dysfunction. So when it comes to endothelial cell dysfunction, really what that means is that the lining of the blood vessels aren't doing what they need to do, right? They're not controlling that process of dilating the blood vessels, opening them up so that the pressure isn't as tough, right? And a part of that is because we've got that oxidative stress, or the reactive oxygen species. So this is aging is oxidative stress. Just staying on this earth long enough will do it. The stuff that we're eating, stuff that we're exposed to, just the day stress, losing loved ones, watching the news, all of that can add up to oxidative stress and reactive oxygen species. So what happens when that endothelial cell starts to not work, so the lining of the blood vessels stop working, what happens is our ability to make nitric oxide actually starts to decrease. So if you see here, we've got a wide open blood vessel and we've got a narrow blood vessel. So since nitric oxide levels plummet and we're not able to access as much, we're not able to make as much, now we're staying in this constricted version. So if you think about the health of the D, when you think about the erections, you think about vaginal secretions, you think about all that. When we're going back to even talking about sexual health, that blood vessel being tiny like that means that blood flow isn't getting there like it used to. And what's happening is not only is blood flow not getting places like they used to, but it's under pressure as it gets there, right? So then if your blood is coursing through your body under high pressure like that, now it's banging up against the kidneys. Now it's banging up against different things. Now it's hitting the blood vessel in certain angles. Now we're increasing our risk of a stroke. We're increasing our risk of a heart attack. We're increasing the risk of kidney damage, right? So now we've gotten to the point where now we have impaired widening of those blood vessels, right? So we have that vasodilation, which is what we want. We want those blood vessels wide open. Now, all of a sudden, our body isn't as able to relax the blood vessels like they used to so that they could expand. So now we're kind of stuck in this vascular constriction space, right? Where the blood vessels are clamped down instead of wide open. So that's contributing to hypertension. But on top of that, one of the other things we said is stiffness, not erectile stiffness. We want erectile stiffness, but what we do not want our blood vessels stiff. Because if they're stiff and they're stuck like this, now when something happens that could potentially cause us to relax, cause those blood vessels to relax and decrease pressure and increase blood flow, now all of a sudden, because they're stiff, there's not as much elasticity to those blood vessels. Now, all of a sudden, we can't even go back to this. We wish we could, but vasodilation becomes a memory. The good part about this is we can talk about, and we'll talk about, how do we fix it? How do we stay more in this space than in this space? And Tom is experiencing it right now because he's doing smoothie recipes. You don't even have to do smoothie recipes. There's other ways to do this. So let's talk about it. Now, blood vessels stiffen, right? So we don't want stiffness. Now, if you're following me and you follow what we're talking about in terms of erectile health or even vaginal health, as that tissue down there actually starts to age and it starts to kind of shrink, the blood vessels are stiffening there. And so that they're not expanding and they're not accepting blood flow the way we want them to. So what's impacting vascular calcification, as we call it, or vascular stiffness? Aging, lower nitric oxide levels, endothelial damage. That just basically means the lining of the blood vessels is damaged, so it's not doing what it needs to do. It's not making nitric oxide. It's not relaxing. Phosphate and calcium can build up because phosphate and calcium, our bodies are designed to kind of metabolize these very nicely. But what happens over time is that now maybe they can't, and that calcium starts to build up and it starts to actually stiffen the arteries. Some of you are taking vitamin D3, but because that vitamin D3 doesn't have vitamin K in it, sometimes that vitamin D3 is sitting around in our systems, and it too is contributing to stiffness of blood vessels, right? Then we have chronic nervous system activation, right? Sympathetic nervous system activation. And what is that? Chronic stress, right? Chronic stress has us in this fight or flight mode. And so remember, when we're in fight or flight, what happens? Those blood vessels clamp down and they're tight and tiny instead of large and relaxed. And so what happens? Of course, now that is contributing to vascular calcification. Insulin resistance. Those of you who are maybe pre-diabetic or diabetic or used to be diabetic, or your A1C is right where it needs to be. Insulin resistance is making those blood vessels stiffer than we want them to. Diabetes is making it stiffer. And good old-fashioned smoking, of course, is making the blood vessels stiffer. They cannot relax. And so you're stuck in this contracted space where now blood pressure is elevated. One thing about vascular stiffness is it predicts heart disease. The stiffer your arteries are, the more likely you are to have heart disease. The older that those arteries are, the poor condition that endothelium is, the less nitric oxide is available. That's what predicts the age of your blood vessels, right? There's something called a coronary calcium score. What are they doing when they're doing a coronary calcium score? They're actually using vascular stiffness to predict where you are in terms of a risk of heart disease, right? So vascular stiffness equals artery stiffness. So the sympathetic nervous system, that's our fight or flight system, like stress, like how do I relax? So when you're stressed, chronic stimulation is regulated, that sympathetic nervous system, regulating blood pressure and whether or not the blood vessels are relaxed or stiff, that's actually regulated by nitric oxide. So the sympathetic nervous system can be amplified when nitric oxide levels are low, when magnesium levels are low, right? And then, of course, there's retained fluid volume. So remember that first picture I put up with the pump. So it shows the pump and how the heart is pumping and how that fluid volume, how much fluid that is there that's pumping really impacts blood pressure, particularly if the vessels that the heart is pumping through are constricted and tiny instead of loose and open enough to accommodate that extra volume, right? So with all of that being said, we talked about the stiffness, we talked about the resistance, right? We talked about the volume, we talked about the pumping, we talked about all of that when it comes to what's causing hypertension and blood pressure. Well, let's talk about how we can decrease blood pressure, right? In a natural space. But this is not new information. A lot of the blood pressure medicines that are out there, right? Like diuretics. What are diuretics trying to do? Or water pills, as we call them when we give them to you. They're actually designed to pull some of the fluid off so that maybe that blood pressure will go down because there's less fluid circulating, right? But what it doesn't address is that stiffness of the artery, or whether or not the artery is wide open versus whether or not it's tiny. It is a Band-Aid situation for what's really happening, right? So in order to decrease blood pressure naturally, we got to get those blood vessels less stiff, right? So in order to do that, we got to cut down on the sugar. If you've seen the video on how sugar impacts hypertension way more than salt in most of us, this is part of it. What can we do to decrease the stiffness of the artery so that it's got more elasticity? But what can we do to make it so that it's functioning properly, so that it can expand and dilate when it needs to? We need wider, more open blood vessels. That's vasodilatation. Oops, I'm erasing stuff. What do we need? And then we also need to decrease circulating volume. All of that would help decrease blood pressure. So we got to fix endothelial cell dysfunction. And so in this quest to kind of understand what's going on and why is it that my Black patients tend to be on a number of medications for hypertension, whereas some of my white patients, you give them one pill and things seem to straighten out. So kind of going down that rabbit hole of trying to figure that piece out, I know that in both, if we can focus on fixing endothelial cell dysfunction, then we have results. We get better erections, we get better blood pressure, we get better brain function, we get everything just seems to improve. But what we found out, if you really start to look at the literature, is that Black folks tend to have impaired nitric oxide dependent blood vessel relaxation. So I'm going to say that again. Black folks tend to have an impaired ability to use nitric oxide properly to expand blood vessels so that blood flow improves. So just to kind of reiterate this, I want to kind of show you a little study here. And I think this is important because I want you all to know that I'm not making any of this up. That is all right here. So this is from the Journal of Clinical Hypertension back in 2006, right? Almost before I was even finished with training, this was known, right? It says impaired nitric oxide dependent vasodilation has been shown to come before hypertension in Black folks with normotension, and in small studies involving regular blood pressure offspring of hypertension patients. Now, you can go back and look at that later because that is a very, very powerful statement, but it sums up kind of what we've been talking about here and what we'll continue to talk about. So what we know is that we can improve hypertension by improving nitric oxide being made in the blood vessels. And we do that with nitric oxide donors. We do that by making sure that vitamin D levels are supported. We do that by making sure that magnesium is on track. We do that by trying to minimize some of the chronic issues that are going on around, stopping smoking, cutting back on the sugar, trying to move more. All of that is going to impact nitric oxide production. But I want to introduce you to a study that was done back in a paper that was published back in 2008 by the National Institute of Health, which is, when I came across this study maybe 2 years ago, I was like, wow, how come this wasn't national news, But what it does, if you scroll to, I think this is page 4 of the journal, it says, these results show that although hypertension is correlated with endothelial dysfunction in both races, so the lining of the blood vessel is really important in both races, African American hypertensives show a greater dysfunction on nitric oxide dependent vasodilation as compared with matched European American hypertensives. So really all that's saying is that when we look at all these results, we see that in Black folks, it is they're having a harder time on those blood vessels using nitric oxide, and in our case, making nitric oxide so that the blood vessels can relax, so that the blood pressure can go down. Right. This is big, right? And this is just something else I want you to look at later. And, you can kind of go back and look at these articles later. I'll put the links below. But to sum it all up, when it comes to what seems to be happening in African Americans and, in me and, my offspring and my parents and things like that, is that in some of us, nitric oxide synthase polymorphisms exist. And what that basically means is that the enzyme that we need to make nitric oxide, that in some of us, there's a genetic SNP or a little bit of a genetic code that's a little off, that's making it so that we're not making nitric oxide at a level that would be majorly useful for us. And the theory is that because of that, that is why we have so much uncontrolled hypertension and why you can be doing so many things right, but still be like, damn, my blood pressure is really high. It's really, really there. So this is the polymorphism right there. It's a NO3, or NOS, nitric oxide synthase 3 polymorphism, and that just is the genotype there, So actually, when you're doing those genetic testings, you can ask them to actually test for this nowadays, so you can take a little bit more personalized approach. But I'd like to come from the approach of thinking of it like we all suffer when it comes to nitric oxide production one way or the other, whether it's because it's genetics or whether it's because it's just hard to make nitric oxide because our food is so depleted of nutrients that it's difficult. If you're eating out every day, if you don't like vegetables, if you don't like green leafy vegetables, all of that, then typically there's nothing, eventually you're not going to be making enough nitric oxide. So how do we decrease hypertension naturally, right? So we got to look at vitamin D levels. And what I'll do is in the coming weeks, we'll expand more on each of these, like the vitamin D levels, the magnesium levels, the nitric oxide levels, and the antioxidants. Like, why are these all so important? Like, what makes this such a big deal when it comes to blood pressure? Like, why do we need hypertension? I had a friend text me the other day. He's like, what is it you said again about magnesium? Why is it so important? But I think at the end of the day, the big thing that you want to keep in mind is that when it comes to blood pressure, supporting nitric oxide levels, that these are going to be the parameters that mean so much. So let me see here. Okay. And just to kind of give you a sneak peek at some notes I made about magnesium supplementation, listen, magnesium, I think about it, I don't really think I have any patients that I don't have magnesium on. Like we may have to go through a couple different brands, we may have to go through a couple different types, but 2/3 of society is low on magnesium. It's hard to get enough magnesium. Magnesium is coming from the spinach, it's coming from the kale, it's coming from the green leafy things, it's coming from pumpkin seeds, pepitas, so a lot of us just really, are depleted of magnesium because too, even sometimes when you're taking those things, sometimes they just don't have enough magnesium in it because they were grown in soil that didn't allow magnesium to really be processed through the leaves. But when it comes to magnesium supplementation, there's studies that it decreases vascular calcification, so the stiffness. It enhances the production of nitric oxide. It helps decrease that norepinephrine or the noradrenaline, that hormone that gets us all amped up and, ready to fight, that stress hormone. It helps decrease it. And then it even helps work with insulin so that our insulin is that our bodies are making is better used to help push calcium to where it needs to go so that we don't have as much stiffness of the arteries and our arteries are better able to relax, and it decreases the amount of sodium in the cell. So getting back to, we're always talking about sodium, cut the salt, cut the salt, cut the salt. Honestly, salt, if you're using the salt with the lady with the umbrella, that with the blue label, you might want to get rid of that. If you're still using Lowry's, you want to get rid of that because, let's face it, that's not real salt. Real salt is from the sea and it's from a natural space. And so those salts can get you in trouble. But when we're talking about salt here, we're talking about the fact that we need to reabsorb the sodium. And if our body can't reabsorb the sodium, that's when we start to have fluid overload, and that's when we start to have issues. So going back to this, vitamin D, magnesium, nitric oxide, and antioxidants is going to be the key. And so that's ultimately why I've introduced you guys to the concept of nitric oxide donors. Nitric oxide donors are coming from the nitrate-rich recipes in the smoothie book, but if you're out to eat, you just take this list here that talks about your shopping list and order from that. If you see something that's got some spinach, some greens, some basil, some kale, some bok choy in it, so you'll know that if you do that, you might be increasing your antioxidant levels. You'll also know that you'll be increasing the nitrates. The recipes also go through and tell you the average nitrate content that are there. But listen, some of you don't like to make smoothies. So fill your diet with nitrate-rich foods. All of that fails? Listen, there are some great nitrate supplements. Using nitrate, taking 1 or 2 capsules a day of an inorganic nitrate to help boost nitric oxide levels. Making sure that you're on a good quality magnesium. Making sure that your vitamin D levels stay maximized. Very seldom, when you go check your vitamin D levels, very seldom are they going to be 60. Are they going to be 50? They're usually going to be 5 and 12 and 13. get those levels up. So all of this is why smoothie recipes help. All of this is why you guys who are taking the nitric oxide supplement that I'm recommending below, that's why your blood pressure is going down. And that's why you're having great results with your erectile function too, because it's all blood flow, it's all related to blood pressure, and it's all related to whether or not those blood vessels are relaxing and constricting, dilating and constricting in a way that's useful for your body and not getting stuck in this calcified, stiff space, right? Okay, so I hope that sheds some light on hypertension.